devices you can install it. And first part of our presentation will cover Ftd installation on ASA. I will show you the whole process to have Firepower Threat Defense successfully installed on ASA box. Then we will continue with Ftd initial setup and policy deployment using Fdm, where we will cover basic configuration using Firepower Device Manager. And by this task, we will finish our first part of the presentation. During the second part of the presentation, we will talk about Ftd installation on Firepower 4100, and we will install Ftd on SSP platform Firepower 4100, and we'll cover overview of Firepower 4100 command line. Then we will continue with Ftd to Fmc registration, because to start configuration on Firepower Threat Defense, we need to register it to the Firepower Management Center, and how to do it we will cover in this section. And we will finish our presentation with Ftd initial setup and policy deployment using Fmc, where we will go through the basic configuration with Firepower Management Center. Let's start with defining next generation firewall. Next generation firewall is the only solution of its kind to add best-in-class threat prevention and application control to advanced firewall capabilities. So, what is Firepower Threat Defense? Firepower Threat Defense is a next generation firewall that combines our proven network firewall with the industry's most effective next generation IPS and advanced malware protection. Firepower Threat Defense is a combination of two operating systems. Firepower, which includes mainly Layer 7 functionality, and ASA, that is covering from Layer 2 to Layer 4 functionality. We combine it in a single operating system, and it has full feature set of Firepower, and we're in progress of continuous migration of all the features that were available on ASA. Firepower Threat Defense is using unified management. It can be managed through the Firepower Management Center, or FMC, which is off-box manager, and it is used in large corporate or enterprise environment, and through Firepower Device Manager, or FDM. It is on-box local manager, which is targeted for small business segment. So to get next generation firewall, you just need to take hardware and combine it with Ftd image. Firepower Threat Defense can be installed on ASA low-end platforms such as 5506, 5508, and 5516, on ASA middle-range platforms such as 5512, 5515, 25, 45, and 55, on SSP platforms Firepower 9300 and Firepower 4100. Also, Ftd supports virtual environment such as ESXi, AWS, and KVM, and it can be installed on ISR 4K router with UCS blade. Firepower Threat Defense cannot be installed on ASA 5585 due to hardware limitations. Now let's talk about licensing on Ftd. So remember how every time you have been asked to provide the serial number of your ASA to have a license? Not anymore. Firepower Threat Defense uses smart licensing implementation, which has nothing to do with the serial number. Licensing is handled by FMC or FDM, and you can enable evaluation mode, which allows you to have full functionality during the 90 days. After that, you will be asked to complete the registration with Cisco Smart Software Manager. Firepower Threat Defense core features are routing, stateful firewalling, next-generation IPS, application visibility and control, URL filtering, advanced malware protection, pre-filter policy, and QoS rate limiting. Apart from this, there are other functionalities that you can configure. Now let's continue with Ftd installation on ASA. And first I would like to cover prerequisites part. So to install the Ftd software, we need to access the Roman prompt. In case you're using low-range platforms, such as 5506, 5508, or 5516, you need to verify that the Roman version of the ASA is 1.1.8 or higher, and if needed, to upgrade it. We need two images to install Ftd, which are boot image and system image. The ASA flash should have at least 3.1 GB free disk space. Boot image must be uploaded to TFTP server, and you need to make sure that the TFTP server is reachable from the ASA. System image should be uploaded to FTP, HTTP, or HTTPS server. So the installation consists of two parts. First, we need to upload the boot image to our ASA, and second, after successful upload, the boot image can then proceed with the system image installation. During the installation, we will configure only one interface, which is going to be our management interface, to provide you an access to firepower threat defense and be able to communicate with Fmc or Fdm. Ftd physical management interface is divided into two logical subinterfaces, which are BR1 or management 0 and the diagnostic subinterface. BR1 subinterface is configured on ASA, and management 0 subinterface you can see on SSP platforms Firepower 9300 or 4100. BR1 subinterface is used in order to assign the Ftd IP address that will be used for Ftd and Fmc communications. It provides SSH and HTTP access to the Ftd box. It's mandatory interface since SF tunnel terminates on it. Diagnostic interface provides remote access to ASA CLI, which on Ftd is called Lina, and it's used as a source for ASA syslog, AAA messages, etc. It's not mandatory to configure it, and actually it's not recommended. The recommendation is to use data interface instead. Now I will show you a recording of Ftd installation on ASA, and we will walk through the whole procedure. First, we need to verify free disk space on our ASA. That's why we're executing command show flash include 3, and as you can see, we have more than 7 GB of free space. Now we're going to reboot our ASA and go to Roman mode. And I will fast forward the recording while our device is rebooting. So when we enter the Roman mode, we need to configure basic network settings and install the boot image. We're configuring address for our interface. We're specifying IP address for our TFTP server and the gateway. Now we're specifying the port through which we're going to have the connectivity. In our case, it will be management. And we need to specify the boot image that we want to upload to our ASA. After that, we need to make sure that we have basic connectivity with our TFTP server. And when connectivity is established, we're executing TFTP download command to start uploading the image. I will fast forward the recording while image is being downloaded. So after the image is downloaded, we're going to setup mode to configure our boot image. And here we're specifying the host name and configuring our management interface. You can configure management interface either manually or via DHCP. In our case, we will do it manually. So we're giving it an IP address, specifying the net mask and the gateway. You can also configure IPv6 address for your management interface. In our case, we will not do it. And now we're specifying the primary DNS server IP. And if you want, you can also configure secondary DNS. Let's do it. And we're specifying the NTP server. After that, the configuration that just been done will be shown for you to review. And if everything is correct, you can apply the changes. Now we need to make sure that we have basic connectivity to our FTP, HTTP, or HTTPS server. It can take some time. And after connectivity is established, we need to execute system install command. You can also execute this command with no confirm option, and you will not be prompted for confirmation messages during the installation process. After that, we're specifying a path, in our case to FTP server, and we're specifying the install image. We will install the Ftd 6.1, so we're specifying 6.1 package. And now the system image is going to be uploaded to our ASA. After system image is uploaded, our device is going to reboot. Again, I will fast forward this process. And now we need to log in with FTD default credentials. The user will be admin, and the password will be admin123 with capital A. Now we need to accept EULA, which is End User License Agreement. So after the EULA is shown, we're pressing the Enter to agree. And now we need to change the password for admin user. In our case, the password will be Cisco. And we need to reinitialize our FTD for second time, following the same procedure as before. The first bootstrap was after the boot image installation in order to be able to access and install the system image package. In the second bootstrap, we're specifying the settings that will be actually used by the device in production. So in our case, we're configuring management interface manually with IPv4 address. We're specifying the host name and DNS servers. And the last step that we need to do, we need to choose either we want to manage the device locally or via O-box management. In our case, we will use Fdm, so we will manage the device locally. And installation process is done. You will be prompted to firepower or clish mode. And from here, you can execute show network command to verify the settings that were specified during the installation process. As you can see, you can verify your management, IP configuration, DNS servers, and the host name. Now let's continue with the presentation. We will cover initial setup and policy deployment using Fdm. As a part of this presentation, we will go through basic setup such as choosing deployment mode, interfaces configuration, routing, system configuration, and NAT. So on Firepower Threat Defense, you have two options to configure FTD mode, which are routed and transparent. These modes derive from the classic ASA. Routed mode is a traditional firewall mode when firewall is acting as a router and becoming a gateway for local hosts. You need to remember that each interface requires an IP address in a different subnet. You can describe it as a layer 3 deployment. In transparent mode, firewall has a role of a bridge which is functioning on layer 2. It's not seen as a router hop for connected devices. However, all the usual firewall checks are in place. FTD mode is specified during the FTD setup process and can be changed from clish CLI, but only when a device is unregistered. Now let's discuss interfaces configuration. On Firepower Threat Defense, we have 6 interfaces, which are routed, switched, passive, passive ER-span, inline pair, and inline pair with stub. First 2 interface modes derive from classic ASA firewall, while the next 4 came from classic Firepower IPS. Routed interface is a traditional layer 3 firewall deployment where traffic is going through full ASA and snort engine checks. The device is working with the real traffic, so it can be affected. You can count switched interface as very similar to classic transparent firewall interface, where you can assign 2 or more physical or logical interfaces to a bridge group, and traffic is going through full ASA and snort engine checks. Passive interface is very similar to IDS. You can configure an interface to monitor traffic using span or mirror port. And in this case, we're working with a copy of the traffic. So the copy of packet is going through few firewall checks and full snort engine checks. Passive ER-span interface is acting like passive interface with one additional feature. It uses GRE tunnel to encapsulate the monitoring traffic. In inline pair, you have 2 physical interfaces which are bridged together. It's very similar to classic inline IPS, and we're working with the real traffic, which bypass many firewall checks and support IPS security policy. In case of inline pair with stub interface, a copy of traffic is going through the NGIPS checks, so actual traffic is not affected. Now let's go to our FDM. But before starting the initial setup, I would like to provide you Firepower Device Manager overview. So, what is FDM? It's a simplified version of FMC, and it's targeted for small and medium business. Keep in mind that FDM doesn't provide full feature parity with FMC, and it is not roadmapped to be the same as FMC. In the first release, FDM has access, NAT, identity policy, and some of device settings available. Currently, FDM supports only routed firewall mode. You cannot configure interface in inline, tap, passive, and passive ER-span modes, and you cannot configure either channel or redundant interfaces. Now let's start our initial setup. We need to log into our FDM. And after the first login, you will be prompted to go through the Easy Setup Wizard. In Easy Setup Wizard, you have 4 steps where we need to choose our outside interface and configure it, specify our time zone and configure NTP server, and the last step is Smart License Registration. To start interfaces configuration, let me show you the topology. So in our case, the Gigabyte 0/1 interface is going to be our inside interface with DHCP server configured. 0/2 interface is going to be our outside interface, and 0/0 is going to be our DMZ interface. So let's go back to FDM and start the Easy Setup Wizard configuration. First, we're selecting our outside interface, which will be Gigabit 0/2, and clicking on Next button. And now, as you can see, FDM by default configured the access control rule, which will trust the traffic which is going from inside to outside, and will block all the other traffic. Now we need to configure our outside interface. You can configure it either with IPv4 and IPv6 IP addresses, and you can configure it using DHCP manually, or you can turn it off. In our case, we're going to configure the interface with IPv4 manual input. So we're specifying the IP address, the network mask will be the same, and the gateway will be our next hop. In our case, we will not configure IPv6, and let's click on Next button. And while FDM is saving changes, let's discuss the last part of step 2. So as you can see here, we can configure DNS servers, and these 2 DNS servers were specified during the Ftd installation process. If you want, you can use OpenDNS or configure the third IP address of DNS server, and also we can change the host name which was specified during the installation process as well. While it's saving changes, let's go back to our presentation and discuss routing on Ftd. Ftd supports static routing and most of dynamic protocols such as BGP and Ospf for IPv4 and IPv6, and RIP version 1 and 2. Ftd doesn't support eGRP, and starting from version 6.1, Ftd supports multicast. If you choose Ftd to be functioning in transparent mode, it will not support dynamic routing protocols. However, you can add a static route for the traffic originating on the FTD and also allow dynamic routing protocols through the FTD with the access control policy. Let's go back to our FDM. And now we're redirected to the third step, where we need to specify the time zone and NTP server. So let's do it. You can use Cisco NTP time server, or you can configure it manually. In our case, we're going to configure it manually. We're giving it an IP address and clicking on Next button. If you want, you can also add another NTP time server. So the last step of the Easy Setup Wizard is Smart Licensing. You can either register device with Cisco Smart Software Manager, or you can start 90-day evaluation period without registration. And in our case, we will proceed with evaluation period. We're clicking on Finish button, and now we can continue either with interfaces configuration or with policies configuration. So let's go to interfaces configuration. And as you can see here already, we have our outside interface configured. And inside interface is pre-configured by FDM, and it also has DHCP server enabled. But in our case, I would like to change the IP address of our inside interface and change DHCP settings. So let's go to Device Dashboard. And here on System Settings, you can see the DHCP server button. We're clicking on this button. And in our case, we will disable auto configuration because the outside interface is not acting as a DHCP client. And let's delete the pool because we want to configure the new pool. But first, we need to go back to Interfaces Configuration. And here we need to reconfigure our inside interface IP address. We're clicking on Save button. So now we can configure our DHCP server with the new pool. So we're clicking on the button to add the new pool. And here we're enabling the DHCP server and specifying the interface on which we want it to be configured. In our case, it will be inside interface. And now we're specifying the pool. And clicking on Add button. Now let's go back to Interfaces Configuration. We also need to specify our Dmz interface. We're giving it a name, we're enabling it, and we're assigning static IPv4 address. And clicking on Save button. Here on the tab, you can see if your interface is up and functioning or not. If it is green, it's up and functioning. If it is orange, it's down. And if it is gray, it's not configured. After interfaces configuration, let's cover routing part. So we need to click on View Configuration button. And as you can see, we already have our default gateway configured, which was applied during the Easy Setup Wizard. And currently, FDM doesn't support dynamic routing protocols, so we will go back to dynamic routing protocols when we will configure our FTD via FMC. The next step will be syslog configuration. So if you're monitoring or troubleshooting FTD appliance, login is going to provide you with the useful information. FTD supports local and external login. Local login is usually used when you need to troubleshoot the issue live. On FTD, you can configure console login with the internal buffer option and secure shell session login. Using external login, we can collect logs and forward them to an external syslog server. It can be useful for monitoring and incident handling. FTD supports the external syslog server and email relay server. We have two levels of login on FTD. ASA login, which derive from classic ASA, and firepower login, which is the same as on classic firepower. Now let's go back to our FDM. On System Settings list, you can see Login Settings button. We're clicking on this button. And FDM supports external syslog server or internal console login. So let's enable login. And in our case, we're going to configure console login. But when configuring the console login, you need to be careful with the login level, as it can overwhelm the console. So let's put, for example, critical level and save our configuration. NAT on FTD. You can configure NAT in both routed and transparent modes. Interfaces that are configured as inline tap, and passive do not support NAT translation. In transparent mode, you cannot configure interface path because transparent firewall does not have any interface IP addresses. Also, ARP inspection and translating between IPv4 and IPv6 networks are not supported. NAT configuration on FTD is exactly the same as on post 8.3 ASA, where you have two ways to implement address translation, AutoNAT and manual NAT. And on FTD, these rules are stored in a single table that has three sections: NAT rules before, AutoNAT rules, and NAT rules after. NAT rules before and NAT rules after sections are equivalent to twice NAT section 1 and section 3 on classic ASA, and AutoNAT rules, which is section which is used for object NAT, is equivalent of section 2 on classic ASA. In AutoNAT, you can use only source as much criteria. This mode is used for dynamic static NAT, and device is automatically orders the rules for processing. In manual NAT, the both source and destination can be used as much criteria, and you can manually configure the order, and it matters for processing. So first the device checks the rules from section 1, then section 2, and finally third one until match is found. When configuring manual NAT rules, you need to make sure that the specific rules come before more generic rules, because in NAT rules before and NAT rules after sections, rules are applied on the first match basis in order they appear in the configuration. In AutoNAT rules section, static rules will be processed first, then dynamic rules. Now let's go back to our FDM. To configure NAT, we need to navigate to Policies tab, and here you can see NAT section. And FDM has one NAT rule technically path rule, which is pre-configured, and the traffic that is coming from any interface to outside interface will be translated to outside interface IP. So let's add one more NAT rule. We're giving it a name. And for example, we would like to configure auto NAT rule. Let it be static. And for example, we want to have the host address that is on inside subnet be translated to the out to DMZ. So as a source interface, we're choosing our inside interface, and DMZ will be our destination interface. And here we're working with objects, so we need to create a new object. And it's going to be a host from our inside subnet. So we're specifying the host type and entering the IP address. Clicking on Add button, and now we're choosing this interface as our original address, and the same we need to do for translated address. So again, we're clicking on Add button and choosing our object. Also, you can click on Show Diagram button, and you can see how your packet will be translated. So we're clicking on OK button. And now we need to be aware that we were saving all the changes that we made, but these changes were not deployed to our FTD. So to deploy the changes, we need to click the deployment button. And if you can see this orange circle, it means that we have some objects that are ready to be deployed. So we're clicking on Deploy Now button. And deployment is in progress. While deployment is in progress, let's go back to our presentation. So we covered all the steps from our initial setup checklist. And now let's do SSH to our FTD management interface to check how the configuration looks from the command line. As you can see now, you're prompted on Clish mode. And starting from 6.1 version, we have the concept of converged CLI, which allows you to execute both ASA and firepower commands from Clish mode. Optionally, you can navigate to the ASA CLI, and for this you need to execute system support diagnostic CLI command. And now we're on ASA mode, and from this mode you can execute classic ASA commands. If we want to go back to Clish mode, we need to press Ctrl+A, then D. So let's do it. And as you can see, we're in Clish mode again. Our changes have been successfully deployed. So let's take a look on this from command line. First, we can verify our IP addresses configuration. Also, we were configuring login. So as you can see, login is enabled. It's console login with critical level. In show run not, we have two rules. The first one that was pre-configured by Fdm, and the second one that we created. And in show route, you can see our default gateway. So now we're going to continue with second part of our presentation. And the first step is Ftd installation on Firepower 4100. So Cisco Firepower 4100 security appliance is a standalone security services platform for network. It is a UCS-based chassis that contains one blade and maximum throughput range from 20 to more than 60 gigabps. The Firepower 4100 uses two basic types of images, which are platform bundles and applications. A platform bundle is its own operating system on the supervisor called the Firepower Extensible Operating System, or FXOS, and an application image is the software image you want to deploy on the security engine. So if you want to deploy Ftd 6.0.x version, the FXOS platform bundle image should be 1.2 and higher. And for Ftd 6.1 version, it should be 2.0.1 and higher. And you can always refer to the FXOS to Ftd compatibility matrix, which you can find on Cisco website. Now I will show you a recording of Ftd installation on SSP platform Firepower 4100, and we will walk through the whole procedure. First of all, we need to log into our Firepower Chassis Manager and verify if our FXOS version is compatible with Ftd version 6.1.0 that we want to install. And as you can see, it's compatible. Now we're navigating to Interfaces tab. And before configuring the interfaces, I would like to show you the topology that we will follow. So in our case, the inside interface will be Ethernet 1/2, outside interface will be Ethernet 1/4, and Dmz interface will be Ethernet 1/5. But also, I would like to discuss with you the management interfaces configuration, because as you can see, we have separate management interface for the Firepower 4100 chassis, and you need to be aware that we cannot use the same management interface for Firepower 4100 chassis and for Ftd. And for this, we need to allocate separate data interface and specify management type on it to be able to SSH to Ftd and register it on Fmc. So in our case, the default type for all the interfaces is data. So we're enabling our Ethernet 1/2 interface. And for Ethernet 1/3 interface, which is going to be our management, we're changing the type to management 1, enabling it and clicking on OK button. And we're doing the same for Ethernet 1/4 and Ethernet 1/5. As you can see on the panel, our interfaces 2, 3, 4, and 5 are up and running. So now we need to navigate to Logical Devices tab, and from here we will start our application installation. For now, we don't have any logical devices available, so we need to click on Add Device button to start installation. And here we're given the name and specifying the version for our FTD. In our case, it will be 610, and clicking on OK button. Now we will be redirected to provisioning mode, where we need to configure our management interface and some additional settings. So to do this, we're clicking on FTD icon, and in General Information tab, we need to specify our management interface, give it an IP address, specify the network mask, and the gateway. Now we're going to Settings tab, and I want to put your attention to Registration Key field, because the registration key is a string of random characters that you will use to make sure that FMC will allow connectivity with FTD. It's not used for session security beyond the first connection. So we will use it only for registration process, and it needs to be matched on FMC and FTD sides. In our case, registration key will be Cisco. Now we're specifying the password if we want to do SSH to our FTD. The password will be admin123. We're putting the FMC IP address, search domains, and we're specifying the firewall mode, which is going to be routed. Now we need to put the DNS IP address. And if you want, you can also put fully qualified host name. And we don't have event interface. Now we go to Agreement tab to agree with EULA. And after that, we're clicking on OK button. Now we need to allocate our data interfaces to FTD. And as you can see, it appears at the bottom. We're clicking on Save button. And on the background, the installation process is started. So I will fast forward the recording. So in the end, your blade should be in online status, and also you can verify your management interface configuration, and you can see data interfaces that have been allocated to our FTD. Now let's continue with FTD to FMC registration. But before starting registration process, you need to make sure that you have smart licensing or evaluation mode enabled on your Firepower Management Center, and you have a base FTD license added to your account. In case you want to use the smart licensing mode, you can create Cisco Smart account at Cisco Software Central. You can see the link on the slide and follow the next steps. First, we need to obtain an ID token from Cisco Smart Software Manager, or CSCM. Then we need to register FMC to CSCM. After that, we need to register FTD to FMC. and apply one or more licenses to FTD devices. Now let's go to our FMC. We need to log in. And first of all, we need to make sure that we have either Smart License or Evaluation Mode enabled. So we're navigating to System, Licenses, Smart Licenses tab. And as you can see, we have Smart Licenses enabled. So now we'll start our registration process. For this, we're navigating to Devices, Device Management tab. And to add a new device, we're clicking on Add Device button. So the host is going to be the management IP address of our FTD. The name can be everything that will be suitable for you. In our case, let's put FTD 4100. And as you remember, registration key should be the same on FTD and FMC side. So we are putting Cisco. And we're creating new access control policy. The default action will be network discovery, and we're clicking on Save button. After that, we need to enable malware, threat, and URL filtering licensing, and we're clicking to Register button. So while the registration is in progress, let's go back to our presentation. So after the registration, we will go through the same checklist, plus we will touch next generation firewall policies deployment to get familiar with the main policies types and their definition. On FTD, you have 7 main access control policy types, which are access control, intrusion, malware and file, SSL, DNS, identity, and prefilter. Let's start from access control policy. Access control policy is your basic firewall policy. It is used to control access to network resources. The policy consists of a set of ordered rules, which are processed from top to bottom. The first rule, where all the traffic criteria are matched, is applied to traffic. On ASA CLI, the access control policy is shown as access control lists. You can control traffic based on traditional network characteristics such as source and destination IP address, protocol, ports, and interfaces, the application that is being used, the destination URL of a web request, including the generalized category of the URL, and the user who is making the request or the user groups to which the user belongs. Intrusion policy checks packets for attacks based on patterns and can block or alter malicious traffic. Let's go to our FMC. And while the registration process is still going, let's quickly verify. So when you're clicking on Add Rule and you're navigating to Inspection tab, you can apply intrusion policy to your access control rule. And here, Cisco has 4 based policies, such as balanced security and connectivity, which is default and recommended, Connectivity over security, where we have fewer rules enabled and only most critical rules block. Security over connectivity, where we have more rules applied and deeper inspection. And maximum detection, where we have various detection over rated throughput. Depends on the policy, depends on which policy is going to be applied. The traffic will be evaluated by different IPS signatures. And also you can create your own intrusion policy, including specific rules that are needed. Now let's continue with malware and file policy. So in malware and file policy, system inspects traffic for prohibited files and malware. AMP for firepower detects and optionally blocks malware in many types of files, including PDFs, Microsoft Office documents, and others. If you want to block not only the transmission of malware files, but all files of a specific type, file control allows you to monitor network traffic for transmissions of specific file types, then either block or allow the file. SSL policy allows you to either block encrypted traffic without inspecting it, or inspect decrypted traffic with access control. Using DNS policy, you can whitelist or blacklist traffic based on the domain name requested by a client. You can configure custom lists and feeds of domain names or use Cisco domain name intelligence. To configure identity policy, you must have realms pre-configured. A realm consists of one or more LDAP or Microsoft Active Directory servers that share the same credentials. And the main function of prefilter policy is bypassing the snort completely. It is the first phase of access control before the system performs more resource-intensive evaluation. So if particular traffic does not require inspection, applying prefilter policy will also improve your performance. Now let's go back to our FMC. And as you can see, our device being registered, and you can verify the IP address of our Ftd management interface, the hardware, software version, which licenses are enabled, and which access control policy is applied. So now let's start from interfaces configuration part. And here we will configure sub-interfaces. Let me show you topology one more time. So we will configure sub-interfaces for Insight and Dmz interfaces. For this, we're clicking on Add Interfaces sub-interface button. So here we're giving it a name, selecting the interface, enabling it, and here you need to pay attention because we have two fields, which are sub-interface ID and VLAN ID. So when you're creating a sub-interface, the sub-interface ID is just for your usage, but VLAN ID matters. In our case, I will put the same. So our VLAN is 204. And we're going to IPv4 tab, where we're specifying the static IP address for our sub-interface. And we're clicking on OK button. Now we need to do the same for our DNZ sub-interface. And again, we're specifying the IP address. Clicking on OK button. And in case of outside interface, we don't want to create a sub-interface. So for this, we're clicking on Edit button that is associated with our interface. We're enabling it and giving it a name. And clicking on OK button. We're saving our changes. And now let's go back to our checklist. So after interfaces configuration, we need to continue with routing. For this, we're navigating to Routing tab. And we will enable OSPF on our Ftd. So here you can have two OSPF processes running at the same time. We're enabling the first one. And now we need to choose Ospf role. So based on network topology, you can choose the router role. Depends on that, we will have specific features enabled or disabled. So for example, in case of internal router, the redistribution, inter-area, filter rule, and summary address tabs are disabled. But if we choose, for example, ASBR, as you can see, summary address and redistribution tab became enabled. So we will choose internal router in our case, and we're navigating to Area tab to create an area. We're clicking on Add button, and the network on the same process can be divided into two different areas. In our case, we have one OSPF process, and we will choose Area 0, which is backbone area. So all the other areas should be directly or indirectly connected to Area 0. And now we need to specify the network which we want to have in our area. For this, we're creating a new object. And specifying the network. And clicking on Save button. Now we need to choose our object and add it. And we're clicking on OK button. Now let's go to Interface tab, where we need to choose the interface on which we want our OSPF process be running. So we're choosing outside interface, and also you can change the default settings such as hello and that intervals and default cost, etc. And also you can configure authentication, either area authentication or using the password or MD5. In our case, we will not use the authentication, so we're clicking on OK button and saving our changes. Now the next step of our initial setup checklist is syslog configuration. So for this, we're navigating to Devices Platform Settings tab. And here we need to create a new policy and specify that we're creating it for Firepower Threat Defense. We're giving it a name and adding our device to the policy and clicking on Save button. Here you can configure SNMP, SMTP server, HTTP configuration, but we will be focused on syslog configuration. So we're navigating to syslog tab. We're enabling login and increasing the size of our internal buffer. Now we're going to Login Destinations tab and clicking on Add button. And as you can see, FMC supports internal buffer login, console, syslog servers, SNMP trap, email, or SSH sessions. In our case, let's configure internal buffer. And again, we need to remember that we shouldn't put the high level, not to overwhelm our box. So let's put, for example, notifications level and click on Save button. Before that, we need to go to syslog settings tab. And here we can enable timestamp on each syslog message. And also, as you can see, we have some syslog messages that are disabled. They're disabled because currently Firepower Threat Defense doesn't support NetFlow, and by default, all NetFlow equivalent syslog messages are disabled. But if you want, you can enable it by clicking on this button. So as you can see now, it's enabled, and we're clicking on Save button. The next step will be configure NAT. But here we need to create an object because, as you remember, we're working with objects when we're creating our NAT rule. So you can create either security zone or interface groups, but on the background, name if still will be used. So we're clicking on Add Security Zone button. And now we're giving it a name. So we will create the security zone for each of our interface. We're choosing the interface type and choosing the interface from our device, adding it to the list and clicking on Save button. The same we need to do for outside and Dmz interfaces. We're choosing outside interface and clicking on Save button. And we're adding the last security zone for our Dmz. So after security zones been created, we can start creating our NAT rules. For this, we're navigating to Devices, NAT tab. And we need to create a new policy again for Firepower Threat Defense, giving it a name, choosing our device, and we will be redirected to configuration part. So here, as you can see, we have three sections: NAT rules before, auto NAT rules, and NAT rules after. So let's create first NAT rule that will translate traffic coming from inside to outside interface IP address. So in our case, it will be path rule. We're clicking on Add Rule button. So it will be auto NAT rule, dynamic. And here where we need to specify source and destination interface objects. So in our case, source will be inside zone 1 and destination will be outside zone 1. We're going to translation tab, and again we need to create the object for our original source. In our case, the object will be our inside subnet. We're clicking on Save button and choosing our object. And in our case, we need to translate it to destination interface IP. So we're specifying this option and clicking on OK button. So as you can see, our NAT rule appeared on Auto NAT Rules section. Now let's create another NAT rule. Let it be manual static NAT rule. And for example, we want to provide an access for our host from Dmz subnet, and we want to translate the IP address to the IP address from our outside subnet if our host is going, for example, to google.com. So in this scenario, we're specifying DMZ zone as a source and outside zone as a destination. We're clicking on Translation tab, and we need to create the object for our host. We're clicking on Save button and choosing our object. We're doing the same. So here we will create a host with IP address from our outside subnet. We need to choose the host. And we're doing the same for the destination. In our case, as I mentioned, it will be Google. And we don't want our destination to be translated. That's why in translated destination, we're choosing the same host and clicking on OK button. We're saving our changes. Now let's go back to our initial setup checklist and let's continue with access control policy configuration. For this, we need to navigate Policies, Access Control. Let's modify our access control policy. We're clicking on Edit button. Now let's create a rule that will allow our traffic to go from inside to outside. So we're clicking on Add Rule button. Let's specify the zones. So our inside zone will be source and outside zone will be destination. We're going to Inspection tab and let's enable intrusion policy. For example, it will be balance security and connectivity. And if you go to Login tab, you can also enable login. So it will be login for Snort engine. And we're clicking on Add button. Yes, we need to specify also the name. Now let's create the second rule. For example, if traffic is going from DMZ to outside, we want to block the botnet traffic. So we're going to URLs tab. We're clicking on botnet category. Reputation will be any, and we're adding it to our rule. So in our case, the action will be block, and let's specify the name. We're going to Login tab and again enabling login. Now we're saving our configuration. And again, to apply all the changes to our firepower threat defense, we need to click to Deploy button and start the deployment. And while the deployment is in progress, I would like to show you how to navigate in our command line on SSP platform Firepower 4100. So we're doing SSH to our management IP address of the Firepower chassis itself. And now you are on MIO or FXOS CLI. From here, we can navigate to Blade or Module CLI. And to do this, we need to execute connect module 1 console command. And now we're on Blade CLI. From here, we need to connect to our application, which is installed on our Blade. In our case, we're executing connect ftd command. And we will be redirected to Clish mode. You can also go to ASA mode, and you need to execute system support diagnostic CLI command. And now we're on ASA mode. So as you can see, our policy deployment was successful. So now let's verify the configuration. Let's go back to Clish. And from here, we're executing show IP command. And as you can see, our sub-interfaces and interface were created. Show run login. Our login is enabled. You can see the buffer size and the buffer level. In show route, you can see that we got the route from OSPF, from our neighbor. And in show OSPF neighbors, you can see that we have a neighborship with our router. So in show run NAT, you can also see that our two rules have been created. So after we finish our configuration from our initial setup checklist, let's summarize our session. So during the session, we covered the Ftd installation process on ASA and SSP platform Firepower 4100. And we did initial setup using Fdm and Fmc. As a summary, we can underline that Firepower Threat Defense Unified Image combines the best from ASA and Firepower operating systems. It can be installed on different hardware, and it supports virtual environment. It has full Firepower feature set, and we're keep migrating the ASA features. Firepower Threat Defense uses unified management, and it can be managed through the off-box manager, which is Fmc, or our new Java-free on-box manager, which is Fdm. And we don't have licenses based on serial numbers anymore, because Ftd uses smart licensing model. For more information, you can go through the configuration guides, through the steps how to reimage ASA or Ftd, and also check FXOS to Ftd compatibility matrix. So thank you so much for your attention.
And thanks a lot to you, Ola. We had a very interactive session on the Q&A, so lots of interest, lots of questions. So thank you, everyone. We still have a few questions that are being answered right now. So if you ask those questions, just stay a few more minutes. The last thing I wanted to mention to you, and you might have missed that at the beginning of the webinar, but we have an appliance promotion for ordering a 4110. So this was announced in the last few days, and this will apply until January. So feel free to use those. There is also a link that I have posted to the chat, and let me post this again so that you know, and you can review this. The last thing I wanted to mention, so this session is being recorded and will be posted on Sales Connect. So give us a week, and then you will be able to find the links to the PDF and also to the recording on MP4 in that link, cs.co security PIW. So thank you so much for your participation. Thanks a lot to Ola for this great presentation, to Veronica, Mickey, and Erkan that helped with the Q&A panel. Have a good rest of the day, everyone, and see you next time will be October 5th at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.